Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of EMCC in Focus. I'm Rachel Ashenden. I'm working on comms and engagement for the Equal Media and Culture Centre for Scotland. And I'm joined by Dr. Miranda Barty-Taylor, who is the project manager of EMCC.
Thanks, Rachel. In these informal conversations at EMCC in Focus, we're hoping you'll join us over lunch or a cup of tea as we chat with academics, organisations and individuals working in and around the media, creative arts, culture and sports sectors in Scotland. The aim is to have conversations and a focus on areas of inequality, so inequality in participation, representation, visibility and so forth. So we'll be talking about some of the obstacles and issues, but we'll also be talking about some of the solutions that we can bring to make sure that everybody's right to participate in Scottish media and culture is upheld.
For this first ever episode, we're going to introduce the work of EMCC, how it came about, and also some of our key partnerships and projects for the coming year. So Miranda, can you tell us a bit about how the centre started?
Yeah, absolutely. So it started out as a series of workshops, essentially, that was funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and organised by a group of key collaborators, including the University of Strathclyde. So those key collaborators came together and formed Gender Equal Media Scotland after those workshops as a way to have a focus for any of the ongoing work and conversations that were happening in this area. So that was going on, and GEMS was sort of formed. And around about the same time in 2018, the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls made a recommendation, advised Nicola Sturgeon then, as it was, to make sure that Scotland had a resourced women in media body. So there was a body focusing on this, excuse me, for future work, for future development work. So a development project came out of that, which Engender formed, which was to look at how that resourced women in media body might actually operate, what it would do and how it would function. And that's where I come in. So I'm a researcher and came in and sort of did a mapping and development project to look at what was going on already, what was the status quo, what was happening elsewhere in Europe, in Australia, in the US that had worked really well. And really a listening project to try to understand better what women and marginalised groups in Scotland need and needed to have better representation in these sectors. The centre is embedded within Engender, which is Scotland's feminist policy and advocacy organisation, and benefits enormously from being part of that structure and part of that team. And yeah, we hope to continue doing the work that Engender has looked at for years, looking at equality and diversity within the media, creative and cultural sectors in Scotland.
And media and culture are so interlinked with society's attitudes because, you know, the way the media writes and speaks about women has this trickle-down effect on our everyday attitudes towards women in real life.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's strong evidence linking representation in all its many forms, public discourse and cultural values that we live by. So we know that gender stereotypes affect students' choice of musical instrument to learn, children's reading outcomes even, our reactions societally to working mothers. And we know also from a more intersectional perspective that representations of, for example, Black women or refugee women or disabled women and so on inform so societal attitudes about them in more complicated ways. So there's the Gina Davis Institute in the United States is a fantastic organization, and they say, you know, if they can see it, they can be it. If children can see it, they can be it. So if we want to see more women in leadership positions in the real world, we need to be able to be producing and consuming more women leaders and women generally in all their multiple ways, in fiction, in culture, in the news, and all of our kind of media and creative output. We also have to think about the impact on boys too, of course, and how representations around toxic masculinity and kind of the dominance and aggression that we often see, and also how portrayals of women as subordinate and sexualized are affecting men and boys' behavior. And, you know, it's interesting that really media interventions can be extremely powerful. And there's evidence that the media interventions which target men and boys specifically show significant attitudinal changes towards not just gender and gender stereotypes, but also in their tolerance of, their acceptance of violent action against women. So so linking media and culture together and understanding how that operates in terms of our broader attitudes and behaviors is really important.
And an important aspect of the centre's work is the media and culture's role in upholding or preventing violence against women and girls.
That's exactly right. And we are also linked in with the Scottish Government's Delivering Equally Safe strategy. A big part of that is primary prevention, looking at those aspects of our society and culture which can be used to help prevent violence from happening in the first place. And we know that we live in a culture of violence. We also know that we need to have a gender equal Scotland before we can fully prevent violence against women and girls. But the power of focusing on the media and creative cultural sectors is, that there's kind of direct and indirect implications of the work that we would do in that area on violence against women and girls. And we've looked elsewhere for examples of best practice as well. Of course, Australia has a national plan to reduce violence against women and girls. And one of its 4 key themes is developing a media code, a code of practice rather, for reporting on violence against women and girls. So if we look at this slide here, we can see some of these direct and indirect impacts. So the smallest blue circle is reporting and representation of violence against women and girls in Scottish news media and broadcasting press. And the way that that's done and the language and imagery that's chosen to do that can then have a knock-on effect on our stereotypes and gender roles that we consume and we reproduce in broader culture. And that also has an impact then on our economic and employment opportunities, as we talked about before, and then more broadly, obviously our societal attitudes and behaviours. So the work of the new Equal Media and Culture Centre for Scotland will have a direct impact on or help kind of work towards the 4 key priorities of the Scottish Government's Delivering Equally Safe strategy, which are here on the slide. Supporting representations of women that encourage men to desist from all forms of violence, upholding space for women to work and be involved in and influence in public life, and so forth and so on. So it's a really powerful sector, the media and culture sectors, to focus on in that respect.
Let's turn now to the initial development project for the centre. What were your key findings from that as well?
Yes, so we formed a theory of change out of that initial development project. The theory of change underpins the proposal for the delivery of the new centre, and it just means that we have an evidence-based understanding of some of the obstacles, the key obstacles, some of the important strategies that we know can work, and then the knock-on effect and some of the outputs and outcomes from that. And you can find a graphic with this theory of change laid out on the centre's website, and hopefully Rachel will be able to make it appear here now for you to look at. But having that process-driven approach makes it easier for us to measure our progress and to understand where we can target interventions kind of most effectively, I suppose. One of the key findings from that is that, and from gender change theory in general, is that if we are trying to make these big kind of societal shifts, we need to be addressing 3 pillars of gender inequality simultaneously when we're looking specifically at these sectors. So the first of those is the content, so what's being produced and what's being consumed, and there's representations there, and we've talked a little bit about that already in stereotypes. The next one is the workforce, so not just who is participating, who's visible, who's missing, whose voices are missing, but also the culture within workplaces and workplace policies and practices. So are those being utilised in the best way possible to make sure that we are diversifying the people who are producing our content? And then the third thing is leadership, so looking very closely at who is sitting in those decision-making spaces, in that axis of power, and making those decisions from the top down across the industries.
And the centre is going to be focusing on all 3 of these areas over the coming years.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through some of the centre's key aims and objectives, Miranda?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the key things that came out of the development project is essentially a lack of Scottish-specific intersectional long-term data. And so the main focus of the centre is to do that research and monitoring work cross-sectorally in order to provide sort of scrutiny and long-term understanding of trends and patterns and progress, and where support is more needed. But we're very, very conscious that, data is alone is not the be all and end all, and that's why the second incredibly important part of our work is engagement, and that's where that comes in. So we're conscious of community groups, grassroots groups working again across the sectors, who are already doing incredible work in these areas. And we really want to complement and contribute towards those existing efforts as far as we can through partnership working, which is a big part of what we do. So we're engaging with lots of groups, organizations, researchers, women's sector bodies, horizontally and vertically across the different sectors. And we're also learning from best practice overseas, understanding what's happening there. And I guess the third aspect of our work is advocacy. So we're embedded within Engender, as I said. Engender has expertise in policy and advocacy, so we're kind of leaning on them as well to do this advocacy part of our role, both with institutions but also within with policymakers and within Scottish Government.
Absolutely, and we also have an advisory group who contribute to this expertise as well.
Absolutely right. So GEMS, who I mentioned before, has merged into our advisory group. So we're really fortunate that we have representatives on there from the women's sector, from Rape Crisis Scotland, from Scottish Women's Aid, from Zero Tolerance. We also have academics and researchers from Strathclyde, from the University of Western Scotland. And then we also have some key bodies who are doing work cross-sectorally who sit on our advisory group as well. So the Musicians Union, Glasgow Women's Library, Women in Journalism Scotland, the advisory Scottish Women in Sport, and the Association of Journalism Education all sit on the advisory group and help inform the work of the centre, which is just invaluable.
So let's drill down a little on each of these. I know on the engagement side of things, we're in the middle of planning a big launch for the centre, and we're building these key relationships with partners such as Glasgow University Media Group, the Sir Lenny Henry Media Diversity Institute in Birmingham, and also the Gina Davis Institute in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. We're also involved in events across the year. So we've just been involved in some workshops with Pass the Mic, which has been fantastic. We've also got an event planned later in the year with the Association for Journalism Education. So that's going to be a set of online workshops, which hopefully there's scope to expand these later. But initially, it's going to be for media journalism and creative writing students to better understand how the language that they choose to use has a real narrative power, and it has power beyond the words on the page, and to really apply a gendered lens to their writing. And we hope to be able to collaborate with partners after that and extend it, so it's not just students but also educators within universities and colleges, and then also with journalists themselves to better understand the impact of their writing.
And what about the research, Miranda?
Yeah, so that sort of forms the main part of the work, I suppose. So internally, we're working on a leadership paper at the moment, which echoes Engender's Sex and Power piece of work, which is vast. We're doing an analysis specifically on the media and the creative and cultural sectors, doing an analysis of sex and race at the top there. So who are their CEOs, who's sitting on their boards, who are the chairs of the boards. And this will give us a kind of, I guess, status quo, a benchmark of where we're at and where that axis of power lies. So, for example, just one finding from yesterday is that we've got sort of 12 national orchestras, choirs, bands, and the musical directors of all 12 are currently white men. So we do have work to do in some areas to try to shift those figures. But we're also using a media monitoring tool, which will help us analyse digital violence in Scotland, and look at news articles on a range of topics, including violence against women and also gendered coverage of sport, for example. So we'll be releasing papers throughout the year. Externally, we also have the ability fortunately, to commission some work by expert academics across Scotland. So we've got one paper on the experiences of multiply marginalised women who are working in and around these sectors, and what their experience of EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives are, whether those work or not, and which ones can be kind of improved. But we've got another paper which is looking at the human right to cultural participation. So how this is played out in our domestic culture policy, for example, and how different social groups experience that differently. And we also are fortunate to be able to host some students on placements from some of the universities in Scotland. So we've got a couple of their reports coming out, one on the Glasgow Film Festival and one looking at digital violence against women and politicians specifically in Scotland. So it's really important that we have those relationships with academics, researchers, students, so that we're able to cross like a range of different topics and bring all those together under one roof, I suppose.
And finally, Miranda, can you tell us more about the advocacy side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really important to us that we're able to play critical friend to institutions and organisations working in Scotland. Many of them are under immense economic pressures, particularly right now. So it's important for us to understand, contextually what the different, restraints and pressures are, so that we can work collaboratively to try to improve equality and diversity in those institutions and organisations. So we are looking specifically to hold them accountable for the practices and policies that many of them still have, which sustain gender inequality in different ways. But it's really all about building those relationships, holding events, knowledge exchange, sharing learning between folks, so that we can, we're quite a small country, so there are overlapping issues, but there's also overlapping solutions, and we can learn from one another, which is going to be really positive. Our advocacy also extends to policy making and Parliament. So for example, we recently sat on a roundtable hosted by Rona Mackay, MSP, at the Scottish Parliament, which was looking specifically at the role of news media in perpetuating certain stereotypes around violence against women and girls, and what they can do to better reduce that. So we'll be continuing our advocacy with Parliament, and we are filling in consultation responses and working with other organisations cross-sectorally to make sure that our impact can be, really felt where it needs to be.
Wonderful. Thanks, Miranda. And thanks everyone for joining the first ever episode of EMCC in Focus. We'll include any of the reports that we've mentioned in the show notes and YouTube below. And feel free to use the hashtag EMCC in Focus on Twitter and let us know any of your reflections. Bye for now.
So much. Bye.